It was the fourth night. 4 nights since the Alpha King's wolves had driven off every healer in the territory, and the sick children still lay curled on their cots in the lower hall of Varketh Keep, their breathing thin and labored as winter thread. 4 nights since Mira had stood at the edge of the village square and watched the king's guards carry out the last physician's bag and drop it in the mud. 4 nights since she had told herself it wasn't her problem, that she was nobody, that an Omega girl with no pack rank and no formal training had no business walking through the iron gates of the most feared Alpha King in the Northern Territories. She walked through the iron gates on the fourth night anyway. She told herself she was only going to look, that she would assess the children and come home, that she wouldn't stay, wouldn't linger, wouldn't draw the attention of the wolves, who had already turned away healers with credentials and court letters and proper silver instruments in their bags. She carried nothing but a worn canvas sack, a clay jar of dried herbs, a small copper pot for steeping, and the particular kind of knowing that had no name and no certificate. Only years of sitting with animals too wild to be handled, with injured packmates others had given up on, with the kinds of creatures who needed presence more than poultice. She crossed the courtyard with her head down. No one stopped her. That should have frightened her more than it did. Mira had grown up on the edge of the Harrow Wood, the daughter of a healer woman who had died when Mira was 11, and left her with a house full of dried things hanging from the rafters, and a way of understanding pain that she had never been able to explain to anyone who didn't already feel it themselves. She was 23 now, and she had spent 12 years learning that her kind of knowing made people uneasy. She was too quiet. She sat too still. She didn't flinch when things were dying. Her pack, what was left of it, the scattered remnant of a family pack that had no alpha, no standing, no territory to speak of, tolerated her in the way that people tolerate a useful tool they don't entirely understand. She ranked Omega, not because she lacked strength, but because she lacked the particular hunger for precedence that rank rewarded. She had never wanted what they were all fighting for. She had never wanted anything that she could name out loud. She was fairly certain, walking through the shadow of Varketh Keep's eastern arch, that she had made a catastrophic mistake. The keep was older than the current bloodline, older than the wars that had made Aldrich Varketh the undisputed Alpha King of the Northern Territories, older than the treaty that had carved the land into its current shape. It was built from the black stone of the northern mountains, and at night it absorbed the moonlight rather than reflecting it, so that standing in its shadow was like standing inside something breathing. Mira noticed that before she noticed anything else, the sense of aliveness in the stone. Her mother had believed that places held what had happened inside them, that enough emotion soaked into walls and floors and became something almost mineral, almost real. Varketh Keep had held a great deal. She found the sick children, because she could smell the fever from the outer corridor. There were 7 of them. The youngest was perhaps 3 years old. They lay on low cots in a long room lit by a single line of oil lamps along the far wall, and 3 of them were conscious, watching her enter with the wide, flat stare of children too exhausted to be afraid. 2 wolves sat against the far wall, guards, she supposed, or perhaps just pack members who hadn't been able to leave. They were big. They looked at her the way the others had looked at every healer who had come and been turned away, with a wariness so deep it had curdled into something almost hostile. And she understood, looking at them, that the rejection of the healers had not been the king's cruelty. It had been his wolves' fear. They had been afraid of being wrong again, afraid of trusting something that would fail. She set her bag down on the floor and sat cross-legged beside the nearest cot. Neither guard moved. She didn't speak to them. She spoke to the child, a boy of about 5 with dark hair matted with sweat against his forehead. She said, "I'm going to sit with you for a little while. You don't have to do anything." And the boy looked at her and then slowly, closed his eyes. She stayed until morning. She stayed the second night too, and the third. By the third night, two of the children had broken their fevers, and the guards had stopped watching her with hostility. They watched her now with something more complicated, a kind of exhausted hope that was more frightening than the hostility had been, because it meant they were beginning to depend on her, and Mira understood dependence. She understood what it cost people to allow it, especially wolves who had already been failed so many times they had built their failure into a system. She was careful with it. She didn't speak too much or too little. She brewed her herbs in the copper pot, and she sat and she waited and she let the room breathe around her. And the children got better with the particular stubbornness of young things that are not yet finished with the world. It was on the third night that she first became aware of him. She had not seen the Alpha King yet. She had been told by the guard who had finally, on her second night, stopped blocking the corridor and started letting her pass without incident, that the king was aware of her presence, that he had been told an Omega girl from the edge of the wood had been coming in through the east gate and sitting with his sick wolves, that he had not ordered her removed. The guard had said this in a tone that conveyed how significant that particular non-action was. Mira had nodded and carried her bag past him and said nothing, because she didn't know what to say, and because the part of her that tracked the living weight of things could already feel something above her, something large and still and heavy with something she didn't have a word for yet. On the third night, she felt the weight of him above her in the keep, and understood that he was awake up there in whatever room looked down over the courtyard, and that he had been awake on the other nights too. She didn't look up. She focused on the child nearest to crisis, and she stayed, and she didn't let herself think about what it meant that she could feel him this clearly, this precisely. The way she had sometimes as a girl felt the exact location of a wild thing in the dark wood just before it became visible. She was not supposed to be able to feel him like that. He was an Alpha King. She was an unmated Omega, with no rank and no pack and no business being anywhere near the gravitational field of a man who could end her with a word. She went home before dawn. She didn't sleep. She came back the following night. This was the fourth night, and it was on the fourth night that the door at the end of the corridor opened, and Aldrich Varketh walked in. She heard him before she saw him. Not footsteps, exactly, but the change in air pressure, the way the room shifted its weight when he entered. The two guards stood immediately, and one of the conscious children sat up in his cot, and Mira very carefully didn't move, because she understood that stillness was sometimes the most respectful response, and that any sudden motion might read as fright. And she was not frightened. She was something else. She was something she did not yet have a word for. He stopped a few feet inside the doorway. She looked up at him. She had heard stories about Aldrich Varketh, the way everyone in the Northern Territories had heard stories, half legend, half warning. The Alpha King who had killed his own challenger at 16. The wolf whose shift had reportedly stopped 3 grown men dead in their tracks simply from the force of the aura that accompanied it. The king who had not taken a mate in 15 years of rule, who was said to keep himself cold and remote because anything warmer was a liability he couldn't afford. She had built a picture of him in her mind from those stories, and it looked nothing like the man standing in the doorway. He was large, that part was accurate, broad through the shoulders in a way that made the doorframe seem like an afterthought, with the kind of build that came not from ceremony, but from use, from years of doing hard things with a body made for hard things. His hair was dark and cut close, and he was perhaps 35, and there were lines around his eyes that belonged to someone who had spent a great deal of time watching things he couldn't stop. He was dressed plainly, no ceremonial fur, no court markings. He looked like a man who had been sitting alone in a dark room for 3 nights and had finally come down to see for himself His eyes met hers and she felt it, not metaphorically, not the soft, romantic way the village girls described seeing their intended across a room. She felt it in her marrow, in the place behind her sternum where the pack bond would have lived if she had a pack, in the back of her throat where the wolf she rarely let surface kept its silence. It was a recognition so complete and so unasked, for that she lost her breath and then caught it and sat very still and didn't look away because looking away would have been dishonest, and Mira had never been good at dishonesty. He was looking at her, the way she sometimes felt him looking when he stood above in the dark keep, with an intensity that was not aggression and not warmth, and was something entirely its own. Like heat before fire, like the moment before rain when you can smell what is coming. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then he said, "You're the Omega girl." She said, "I'm Mira." He looked at her for another beat. Then he looked at the children, moving through them with his gaze, counting, assessing, noting who was better and who was not. She watched him do it and saw the careful way he kept his expression locked, the way he kept the worry from showing, and she thought that this was not a man who felt nothing. This was a man who felt a great deal, and had decided that feeling it visibly was a kind of weakness he couldn't survive. She wondered what had taught him that. She wondered if he knew she could see through it. He said, "Two of them are better." "Yes," she said. "Siren will break his fever by tomorrow night if I come back. And Seifa." She looked at the small girl in the last cot, the 3-year-old. "She's the one I'm most concerned about." He crossed the room. He moved the way large predators move when they're being careful about it, with a deliberateness that was its own kind of grace, and crouched down beside Seifa's cot and looked at the small girl with an expression that Mira was not meant to see, something unguarded, something that did not belong to the Alpha King of the Northern Territories and everything to the man underneath. He said quietly, "She's been sick the longest, I know," Mira said. "I've been working backward from the worst." He looked at her then, across the small girl's cot, and she felt the full weight of his attention in a way that was different from the recognition. More immediate, more specific, an assessment not hostile, almost curious, in the way that careful, self-contained people are curious, wanting to understand without wanting to show the wanting. He said, "Why did you come?" She thought about how to answer. She said, "Because they were sick and no one was helping them." "You could have been turned away. My wolves have turned away people with far more right to be here than an Omega girl with a canvas sack." "I know," she said, "but you came anyway." "Yes." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he stood, with that same deliberateness, and said, "I'll have food sent to you." She blinked. "I don't need." "You've been here 3 nights," he said. "You haven't eaten during any of them. I know because I asked." He said this simply, without inflection. But she heard what was underneath it and felt the warmth of it, the careful, precise warmth of a man who notices things and acts on what he notices even when he has decided not to feel them. "I'll have food sent. You don't have to accept it, but I'll have it sent." He left. The door at the end of the corridor closed behind him. Mira sat for a long moment in the lamplight, listening to the breathing of the children, and tried to understand what was happening in her chest. She came back the next night, and the night after that. Seifa broke her fever on the 6th night, in the deep hour before dawn, when the child's small body seemed to make a decision about living and followed through on it. Mira sat with her through the crisis point, one hand resting lightly on the small back, feeling the shift in temperature and breathing that meant the worst was over. And she allowed herself to cry a little when it happened, quietly, where no one could see, except that the door at the end of the corridor opened, and she knew from the change in the air that Aldrich Varketh was standing there watching. And so someone could see, after all. He didn't come into the room. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and she heard him exhale. One breath, controlled, the sound of a man releasing something he had been holding for a long time. "She's going to be all right," Mira said. She didn't look up to give him time to compose whatever he needed to compose. She needs rest and the tea twice a day for another week, but she's going to be fine, he said. Thank you. She had not expected him to say it, and she had not expected it to land the way it did, heavy and specifics, and not in the least performative. It was not a king's thank you. It was the thank you of a man who had been afraid, and was no longer afraid, and who was giving her the truth of that without dressing it in ceremony. She pressed her lips together and nodded. He came into the room then, crossing to a chair against the far wall and sitting with his forearms on his knees, in the same loose, watchful posture she had seen the guards maintain. And they sat together in the quiet while Sepha slept her healing sleep, and neither of them spoke for a long time. When the dawn light began at the windows, he said, "You could come back. Not for them, they'll be well soon. But there's a wing of the keep where the older wolves stay, the injured ones from the border skirmishes. They've stopped responding to the healers I've brought in, and I don't know if it's the injuries or something else. I don't know if you could do anything." He paused. "I'm asking because I don't know what else to ask." She looked at him. He was looking at the sleeping child. His profile in the early light was something she wanted to memorize without letting herself know she was doing it. She said, "I'll come." She came. What happened over the following weeks was not simple, and she would not have wanted it to be. The injured wolves in the eastern wing were a different kind of difficulty than the sick children. Older, more guarded, more deeply entrenched in whatever they had decided about themselves and their situation. 3 of them had been injured in the border skirmishes 6 months before and had not healed the way wolves were supposed to heal. And Mira spent her first several visits simply sitting with them, doing very little, letting them grow accustomed to her presence before she asked anything of their bodies. She understood that the physical injuries were real, but not the whole story. She understood that there was a kind of wounding that went deeper than tissue. She understood this because she had her own version of it. The wound of being ranked too low to matter. The wound of having her particular knowing dismissed as superstition or coincidence by people who needed formal systems to feel safe. She did not tell the injured wolves any of this. She simply sat with them in the knowledge of it, and slowly, over the course of 2 weeks, one of them began to eat more. And then another began to sleep less fitfully, and the third, the youngest, a wolf of about 20 who hadn't spoken in months, said one afternoon, while she was changing the dressing on his shoulder, "You don't smell like any healer I've ever had." She said, "What do I smell like?" He thought about it. She said, "Like the wood, the far part of the wood where nobody goes." She thought that was the kindest thing anyone had said to her in years. Aldrich came to the eastern wing every evening. He did not come as an inspection, or rather, he came as an inspection, but stayed as something else, lingering in the corridor, appearing in the doorway, finding reasons to be in the vicinity of wherever she was. She was aware of this. She was aware of it with a precision that she tried to manage and largely failed to manage. Because the recognition she had felt when he first walked into the room of sick children had not faded. It had deepened. It had become something with texture and weight, something that sat inside her and knew itself, and she had a name for it now, even if she couldn't say it out loud. She was his mate. She knew it the way she knew where the fever was breaking before the temperature visibly dropped. The way she knew which injured animal would recover and which one had already decided differently. It wasn't a feeling. It was a fact, the kind of fact that existed independently of whether she wanted it to, or whether it was convenient, or whether it made any sense given the distance between their ranks and circumstances. She was an Omega girl with a canvas sack, and he was the Alpha King of the Northern Territories. And the mate bond did not care about any of that. The mate bond was older and more permanent than rank systems, older than keeps built from black mountain stone, older than any war that had ever been fought over territory. She told herself she would not act on it. She told herself her job was the healing, that she was here for the wolves and the children, and not for the man who stood in doorways, watching her with that careful, controlled intensity. She told herself she would do her work and go home and let the bond exist in her chest as a dull, permanent ache, that she would eventually learn to manage the way you learn to manage a scar, feeling it in cold weather, having to be careful not to put weight on it, but livable, fine. She had lived with harder things. She was not prepared for him to be kind. That was the thing she had not accounted for. In all her careful preparation for this to be impossible, she had prepared for coldness, for the distance she had been told he maintained as a matter of policy. She had not prepared for the food that appeared every night at the entrance to whichever wing she was working in, brought by a quiet young wolf who said nothing about who had sent it. She had not prepared for the evening 2 weeks into her work with the injured wolves, when she was trying to move a heavy storage chest to reach the herbs she'd stored behind it, and he walked in and moved it with one hand, as though it weighed nothing, and then stood so with his hand on the lid and said, "What else?" She had not prepared for the nights when she stayed past the hour she should have, and walked out to find him still in the keep. And they would walk together through the main courtyard without planning to, falling into step as though they had always walked like this, and talk in the low, even way of two people who are comfortable with silence and use words only when they have something specific to give. He asked about her mother on one of those walks. She told him about the house with the dried things in the rafters, about learning to steep herbs in the dark when the lamps ran out, about the particular loneliness of being the daughter of a healer woman in a pack that was uncomfortable with what healers knew. He listened with his hands behind his back, watching the courtyard ahead of them, and when she finished, he said, "She would have been good at what you do." She stopped walking. "What do you mean?" "Making people feel less afraid," he said. He was still walking, and she had to catch up. And she didn't let herself look at his face when she did, because she was fairly certain she would not be able to manage what she saw there. "My wolves were afraid. The children were afraid. You made them less afraid. It's harder than most people understand," she said. "You're not afraid of anything." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm afraid of several things." She wanted to ask. She didn't ask. She walked beside him in the dark courtyard and felt the mate bond in her chest like a second heartbeat that didn't belong to her. And she held it carefully and didn't put weight on it, and told herself this was enough. This was more than she had any right to. 3 days later, everything changed in the way things change when a current has been building for long enough. Suddenly and all at once, and with the particular violence of inevitability, she was in the eastern wing with the youngest wolf, us, Davin, who had begun to speak in full sentences again, and whose shoulder was healing at a rate that the other caregiver called perhaps remarkable, and that Mira privately attributed to the fact that he had decided to get better, which was always the first medicine. When she heard raised voices in the corridor, she recognized one of them as belonging to the king's court steward, a precise cold man named Lorik, who had never spoken directly to her, and whose opinion of her presence in the keep she had gathered from the particular way he always seemed to need to walk through whichever room she was occupying. The other voice was a woman she didn't recognize. She finished what she was doing with Davin's shoulder and stood and went to the door. Not because it was her place to, but because she could hear Aldrich's name being said in a particular way, and she was attuned to his name now, whether she wanted to be or not. She stood in the corridor and saw the woman who belonged to the unfamiliar voice. She was perhaps 30, and beautiful in the formal way of women who have been trained to be beautiful as an instrument of power, dressed in the deep blue of the Marin pack, silver thread at her collar, her hair braided in the style of an alpha's daughter. She was standing with Lorik at the far end of the corridor, and she was looking at Mira with an expression that managed to be both dismissive and intensely interested. The way you look at something that is smaller than expected, but might still be a problem. Lorik said, "This is the girl I told you about." The woman looked at Mira for another moment. Then she looked away, which managed to be its own kind of comment. She said to Lorik, "The Omega healer, I see." Mira understood then. She understood the way she understood most things. Not in a flash of dramatic revelation, but slowly, with the weight of it arriving in increments. This was the Alliance, the one she had heard the Keep's wolves discuss. In the way people discuss something they're both anticipating and dreading. The Marin pack was the second largest pack in the territory, and their alliance with Varketh was a political necessity that had been in negotiation for months. And an alliance of that kind between two alpha houses was usually sealed in the old way. Lorik said, "Alara Marin will be staying at the Keep for the period of the formal courtship." Mira said, "That's good news for the Keep," and meant it, and turned around and went back into the room with Davin and sat down and did not let any of what she was feeling into her hands, because her hands were still a healer's hands, and they were supposed to bring calm, and she was not going to fail at that on top of everything else. Davin looked at her. He said, "Are you all right?" She said, "I'm always all right," he said. That's not true. With the simple directness of someone who had spent months letting her see him at his worst and had decided that gave him the right to some honesty in return. She said, I know it's not true." She smoothed his bandage flat. "You're going to be able to shift again within the month, I think. The shoulder is past the point where it might re-injure. You can start bearing gentle weight on it." He said, "He watches you." She said, "Don't." He said, "I'm not being cruel. I'm telling you something true. He watches you the way the pack watches the alpha. The way we watch whoever we've decided is the center of gravity. I've never seen him watch anyone that way before." She stood and began organizing the jars on the shelf with unnecessary precision, her back to him. She said, "He's a king. He needs an alliance. The Marin girl is beautiful, and her blood is the right blood, and this is how these things work. And I'm an Omega with no pack and no rank, and I came here to heal his wolves, which I'm doing, and that's what there is." Davin said nothing else. She was grateful for that. She worked through the afternoon, and she told herself she was going to leave before the evening. Before Aldrich came to the wing the way he came every evening, before she had to stand in the same corridor with him, and the knowledge of what Alara Marin's presence meant, and try to maintain the equanimity she had been performing for herself for weeks. She was almost successful. She was in the outer corridor with her canvas bag over her shoulder, 5 minutes from the east gate when she heard him behind her. "You're leaving early," he said. She didn't stop walking. "I'm finished for the day." "You're never finished before dark." His voice had that quality it got when he was saying something carefully, choosing each word with the precision of a man who had spent years learning not to say too much. Did something happen with Davin? She stopped walking. She took one breath, steady, the way she coached herself through the moments before a fever broke. Then she turned around and looked at him. He was standing in the corridor with his arms at his sides, wearing the slightly undone version of himself that she had come to understand was his most honest version. The coat open at the collar. The careful blankness behind his eyes at war with something warmer and more present. He was looking at her the way Davin had described, with that particular gravitational attention, and she looked back at him and she said, "I met Alara Marin today." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I should have told you she was coming." "You don't need to tell me things," she said. "I work in your keep. You don't owe me information about your court. Mira, Davin is doing well. The others are near full recovery. You won't need me much longer, probably. Another 2 weeks." She adjusted the bag on her shoulder. "Congratulations on the alliance. She seems like she'll be good for the pack." She turned around and walked to the east gate. He didn't call after her. She told herself that was better. She told herself the fact that he didn't call after her meant she had handled it correctly, had maintained the correct boundary. had kept the thing appropriately shaped so that it could end without causing damage to either of them. She told herself this all the way home through the dark edge of the Harrow Wood, standing in her mother's kitchen among the dried things in the rafters. Boiling water she didn't need for tea she wouldn't drink, and she went through the full logic of it twice and found it airtight, and sat down at the table and put her face in her hands. She loved him. She had known it for weeks. She had been managing it for weeks with the same careful precision she brought to managing a wound that couldn't be fully healed, only kept clean and monitored and prevented from getting worse. But there was a difference between knowing and knowing, between having a fact live in the intellectual part of you and having it come out of the place where you kept the things that were true, regardless of whether they were useful. She loved him, and he was going to bind himself to the Marin girl, and the keep would finish healing, and she would go back to the edge of the wood, and the dried things in the rafters, and the particular loneliness of knowing things she couldn't explain. She slept badly. She didn't go back to the keep the next day, or the day after. On the third day, one of the guards appeared at her door. Not the gate guard she had come to know, but a different one, young and clearly uncomfortable with his errand. He said that Davin was asking for her. He said this with the slightly over-formal precision of someone who had been given careful instructions about exactly what to say and was following them very literally. She went back. She told herself she was going back for Davin. Davin was fine. His shoulder was where she had expected it. And he demonstrated by raising his arm to a height that would have been impossible 3 weeks ago. And she said, "Good, good, that's excellent, you've been doing the stretches." And he nodded and then said, "He didn't send for you." She said, "What?" "I asked to send for you. I wanted to see you, but I thought you wouldn't come if you thought it was him." He looked at her without apology. He's been in the keep for 3 days. He hasn't gone to the courtyard. He hasn't held meetings. Lorik is managing everything. And Alara Marin has been eating her dinners in her chamber. "Nothing is the way it was," she said. "That's not my." He told the steward this morning that he needs more time before the formal courtship can begin. Davin said this quietly, watching her face. He said he had some things to think through. Lorik was very unhappy about it. The whole eastern wing heard it. Mira sat down on the edge of the cot and thought about this. She said, "That doesn't mean what you want it to mean." Davin said, "I know what his wolf looks like when it's choosing. I've watched it since I was a pup, and I'm telling you that his wolf is choosing, and it's not choosing the Marin girl." He leaned forward with his good arm on his knee. "I'm also telling you that I've watched you every evening for 2 months, and your wolf is choosing too, and I don't know why you're both making it so hard." She looked at him for a long time. Then she stood up, straightened the remaining bandaging she'd been pretending to straighten, and said, "I need to check on the others." She moved through the eastern wing. She checked on the others. She was thorough and she was calm, and she kept her hands steady, and she did not think about what Davin had said. She was almost back to the corridor when she heard the door at the end of the wing, the one that led to the keep's main passages, open and stay open. She stood with her back to it for 1 moment. Then she turned. Aldrich was in the doorway. He was not put together. The coat was open. The darkness under his eyes was several days deep, and he was looking at her with an expression that had abandoned the careful lock she was used to. He was not performing equanimity. He was standing in the doorway, looking at her, the way the bond felt when she stopped trying to manage it. Full and present, and not particularly interested in being reasonable. He said, "You stopped coming," she said. "The work was almost done." "The work," he said. "Yes." He stepped into the corridor. She resisted the instinct to step back, because she refused to be the kind of person who stepped back when things were true, and true things were approaching. He said, "I've been trying to think of how to say something to you for 3 weeks, and I am not good at this kind of saying. I want you to know that I understand this isn't fair to ask, given everything, and that if you tell me to stop, I'll stop, but I need you to understand why I can't simply. He stopped. He ran a hand over his face in the particular way of someone who has spent years being competent at everything and has arrived at the one thing they are not competent at. The Marin alliance is political. I told Lorik this morning it can be political without a mating. The Marin girl knows this. She's relieved, actually. She wants it less than anyone. Mira said, Aldrich, I don't know how to explain what it's been like, he said. Watching you sit with my wolves. Watching you make them less afraid. I've spent 15 years building something cold and useful in myself because anything warm was a weakness they could find and use against the pack. And I had one job, which was keeping the pack alive, and I did it, and I was good at it. And then you walked through the east gate at midnight with a canvas sack, and you sat on the floor with my sick children, and you didn't flinch at a single thing, not at the fever, not at the guards, not at me, and I. He exhaled. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to do this. But I know that I can't ask Alara Marin to be my mate when you're the one I. He stopped again. She said quietly. When I'm the one you what? He said. When you're the one I can't stop thinking about. When every evening for weeks my feet have taken me to whatever room you were in before I decided to go there. When I know where you are in the keep without asking, can feel where you are, and I know what that means. I've always known what that means. And I've been telling myself it was impossible because you're... He caught himself. She said, because I'm an Omega. Because I thought you deserved better than a king who has spent 15 years making himself difficult to love, he said. That's the real thing, not the rank. There's no law that says an Alpha King can't mate an Omega. There are stories older than the territory that say the bond doesn't ask about rank. But there's a great deal wrong with me, Mira, and I've known it longer than I've known you, and I couldn't ask you to take that on without telling you first. The corridor was very quiet. The oil lamps along the wall burned in their steady way. She thought about the man who had moved the storage chest without being asked. The man who sent food to a woman who didn't have the rank to ask for it. The man who crouched beside a sick child's cot at midnight and let an expression live on his face. For 3 seconds that he would never have permitted in front of his court. She thought about what Davin had said about watching a wolf choose, and she thought about what her mother had told her before she died, about the ones who were harder to love, that they were harder because they had spent so long not being loved correctly that they had forgotten it was possible, and that the only thing to do was sit with them through the night and let them remember. She said, I grew up at the edge of the Harrow Wood, and I ranked Omega in a pack that tolerated me the way people tolerate something useful they don't understand. I have spent my whole life being the kind of person that other people look past. I can see things that most people can't see, and I don't know how to explain it to them. And I've spent years watching that make people uncomfortable with me. She looked at him, and I walked into your keep at midnight and sat on the floor with your sick wolves, and I felt you above me in the dark building, and I knew Aldrich. I knew the same way I know where the fever is breaking, and I have been managing it for 3 weeks because I thought the right thing to do was manage it, because I thought anything else was impossible, because you're the king and I'm nothing. He said, You're not nothing. I know I'm not nothing, she said. I know that, but the world has a way of reminding you of what category you're in when you start to forget. He said, Then let me remind you of something else. He was very close now, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him, the particular living heat of an alpha wolf's proximity, and she could feel the bond responding to it in her chest like a fire that had been carefully banked for weeks and was now being given air. You walked into my keep and healed the people I couldn't heal. You sat through 4 nights when everyone with credentials had given up. You looked at Sepha when she was at her worst, and you didn't flinch and you didn't leave. And by morning, she was breathing clearly, and I was standing in a doorway, trying not to feel what I was feeling and completely failing. How could I not love someone who did that? She felt the words land. All of them, but those ones most specifically, the ones she hadn't known she needed. How could I not love someone who did that? Not in spite of what she was, because of it. She said, "You could not love me in private. The court will have opinions." "I am the court," he said. "The court has my opinions," she said. "It won't be easy." "No," he said. She said, "I'm still going to come in through the east gate with a canvas sack." "I'll have it made into a better sack," he said. "Yours has a fraying strap." She laughed. It came out surprised and not quite steady. He looked at her when she laughed the way he had looked at her across Sepha's cot in the dawn light, with that specific, unguarded quality, the expression that didn't belong to the king and everything to the man. She looked back at him and stopped managing the bond and let it exist in her the way it had wanted to exist for weeks, full and warm and holy itself. He reached up and touched her face, not with urgency, with the careful deliberateness he put into everything. The deliberateness of a man who has taught himself to do nothing without intention, and whose intentions she now understood were always more than they appeared. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, and she closed her eyes and felt the bond seal. Not like a lock, like a wound closing, like the moment after the fever breaks. The physical bond of it moved through her like a long, slow breath, the recognition deepening into something structural, something that would be there from now on, the way her heartbeat would be there, a background truth of her existence that she would feel in quiet moments and cold mornings, and the space between sleeping and waking for the rest of her life. She felt his breath change when it happened. Felt him feel it too, the bond settling into both of them with the patient certainty of something that had been waiting. He said her name against her hair. She said his name back. Just his name, just Aldrich, because she had been careful about saying it, and now there was no more reason to be careful. What happened after had the quality of all true things, unhurried, and without any of the drama she might have imagined for it. There was warmth, and there was the stone floor of the keep giving way to a room she had never been in. And there was the Alpha King of the Northern Territories holding her like something he was afraid to damage. And there was herself in his arms, with no pretense of rank or category or appropriateness, just two people who had found each other through a corridor full of oil lamps and sick children and weeks of managed wanting. The mate bond sang its old deep song. The cold she had felt in the keep since the first night, that watchful cold, the cold of something massive waiting to be believed, was gone. She lay with her head on his chest afterward, and listened to his heartbeat, and felt hers, and felt the bond somewhere between them. No longer a dull ache, no longer a thing she was managing, but a living warmth in the space where the pack bond would have lived if she had a pack. She had a pack now, he said, not to the room, but specifically to her, with the low, direct quality he used when he was being true. "I want to do this correctly. I want to present you to the court and tell them. I want it to be public," she said. "You don't have to make declarations on my behalf." He said, "I know I don't have to. I want to." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been a king who showed his people a locked door for 15 years. I'd rather they see me as someone who opens them." She thought about that. She thought about the locked door, and what it had cost him to maintain it, and what it might cost him to be known for something other than that. She thought about the guards who had watched her come through the east gate at midnight with growing hope, and Davin who could raise his arm again, and Sepha sleeping through the night, and all the small ordinary miracles of trust that had accumulated in this keep over the past weeks, and had made something possible that hadn't been possible before. She said, "All right. All right, you agree, or all right, you're humoring me." "All right, I agree," she said. "But I want to keep working with the wolves. I want to keep coming to the eastern wing and the lower hall and wherever else I'm needed. I don't want to be the Alpha King's mate in a ceremonial room somewhere. I want to keep doing what I came here to do." He said, "I would not ask you to be anything other than what you are." She believed him. She believed him not because it was what she wanted to hear, but because it was consistent. Because it was what every small deliberate kindness over the past weeks had been saying. In the language of moved chests and sent food, and a man who stood in corridors for no reason, except that he wanted to be near her. She had been listening to him in that language for weeks, and she trusted the vocabulary. In the morning, she went to the east wing and checked on the wolves and found them as she had left them, progressing toward wholeness at the pace they had set for themselves. And Davin looked at her when she came in and read whatever was different in her face and said nothing except, "Act good," she said. "How's the shoulder?" He demonstrated again, raising it higher this time. She said, "2 more weeks and you can try a gentle shift." He said, "Stay." She understood he didn't mean stay in the room. She said, "I'm not going anywhere." He nodded and lay back and let her do her work. Aldrich was not subtle about the announcement. She had not expected him to be subtle. She had spent enough time reading him to know that when he decided to do something, he did it with the same full deliberate weight that characterized everything he did. He called the court to the main hall at mid-morning, which was not a time for court assemblies, which meant that everyone who entered did so with the knowledge that something unusual was happening. Mira stood to the side of the hall, near the eastern door, which was where she had always stood when she passed through it, and she kept her canvas bag over her shoulder because she had been in the middle of refilling her herbs when the word came. He stood at the front of the hall in his full court presentation, which was the first time she had seen him in it. The wolf fur at his shoulders, the silver at his collar, the weight of the Alpha King in every line of him, and none of it doing anything to diminish the thing she recognized underneath. The man who sent food and moved chests and stood in doorways, he said, in a voice that carried to the back of the hall without effort. 6 weeks ago, an Omega girl came through the east gate with a canvas sack and sat with my sick wolves all night when every credentialed healer in the territory had been turned away. She came back the next night and the one after. She healed the children in the lower hall and the wolves in the eastern wing. She made my people less afraid. She did this with nothing but her own particular knowing and the willingness to stay when others left. He paused. She is my fated mate. The bond was confirmed last night, and I want this court and every wolf in this keep to know that she has my full regard, my full protection, and my full. His voice did something slight, almost imperceptible, a small voluntary relaxing of control. My full love, because how could I not love someone who did that? The hall was very quiet. Lorik, near the front, looked as though he had eaten something unexpected. Alara Marin, standing at the other side of the hall in her deep Marin blue, looked at Mira with an expression that was, surprisingly, genuinely, relief, and something almost warm, and she inclined her head with the grace of someone who has understood all along what was happening and is glad to see it resolved. Someone in the back of the hall started the low rumble that was a pack's acknowledgement. It spread. It moved through the room like a wave moving through water. Every wolf in the hall contributing their voice to it. And Mira stood at the eastern door with her canvas bag on her fraying strap, and she felt it move through her too. The sound of a pack acknowledging its own, and she was its own. She had been made its own by the hours she had sat on stone floors, and the tea she had steeped in a copper pot, and the nights she had stayed through when it would have been easier to leave. She was pack, not because of rank, because of presence, because of choosing to stay. She looked across the hall at Aldrich and found him already looking at her, and she understood that this was what he had wanted her to have. Not the ceremony, not the status, but this, the acknowledgement, the being seen, the room full of his wolves turning their voices toward her and saying without words, "You are ours and we are yours. You sat with us through the worst and we know it. We know what you did." She had walked through the east gate at midnight with a canvas sack because the children were sick and no one was helping them. She had told herself she was only going to look. She had told herself she wouldn't stay. She was still here. She crossed the hall and stood beside him. And he put his hand at the small of her back, and she leaned into it a degree that was not visible to the court, but was visible to him. And he felt it, and his hand pressed warmer, and she felt the bond between them settle deeper into its permanent shape, the shape it would hold from now on, the shape of two people who had found each other in the dark of a keep full of sick wolves and had refused, in their different ways, and for their different reasons, to pretend it wasn't true. In the weeks that followed, the territory got used to her. It was not always easy, and it was not always graceful. There were wolves with long memories for rank who needed time, and there were court traditions she learned slowly and sometimes incorrectly. And there were mornings when she sat in the great stone hall and felt its aliveness around her and thought, very simply, I have no idea how I came to be here. And then looked at Aldrich across the table and found him watching her with that particular patient gravity, and remembered. She kept the canvas bag. He did have the strap repaired, and she let him, because it was the kind of small, deliberate care that she had come to understand was his native language. The way he said things he was still learning to say with words. She kept working in the eastern wing and the lower hall, and, as her reputation spread in the outlying settlements of the pack, traveling with one of the guards on the days when the cases were far enough that it wasn't safe to go alone. The wolves who had been injured in the border skirmishes recovered by midwinter. Davin shifted for the first time in 8 months on a cold, clear morning in the outer courtyard. And she watched it happen from the window of the great hall and cried again, which she was beginning to accept as simply something that happened when things got better. Seifa, the small girl who had been the worst of the sick children, learned to walk again properly around the same time the first snows came, and her mother brought her to the keep one morning. And Seifa went directly to Mira with the absolute confidence of a small child who has been held through the worst and knows exactly where safety lives. Mira crouched down and the child put both arms around her neck. And Mira held her and felt the particular completeness of a thing that had been worth doing. Aldrich was in the corridor. He had not planned to be there, or he had planned it in the way he planned all proximity to her, not consciously, but with the whole body certainty of a wolf whose mate bond had given him a compass that pointed one direction. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, watching, and when she looked up and found him there, she did not hide what was in her face, because she had stopped hiding things from him the night in the corridor, when she had let the bond exist at full strength for the first time. He said, later, when they were alone in the room that was now their room, the room above the courtyard where he had been awake those first 4 nights. I keep thinking about how easily I could have had you removed when you first came through the east gate. The guards asked me, and I said no, and I didn't know why. I told myself it was because the children needed help and you seemed harmless. She said, I am harmless. You are the least harmless person I have ever met, he said, with a certainty that was not unkind. You came in here and changed everything without raising your voice once. You made my wolves trust again. You made me. He looked at her. You made me stop being only the king, she said. You were always more than only the king. You were just the only one who didn't know it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm glad you came through the gate, she said. I'm glad you didn't have me removed. He pulled her close in the way he had of doing it, with one arm and the specific gravity that was his, and she settled against him with the specific easy fit that was theirs. And the stone keep around them was warm with what had happened inside it. With the 4 nights of sick children, and the weeks of injured wolves, and the courtyard walks and the corridor conversations, and all the ordinary, enormous work of 2 people, learning to trust each other in the specific ways they each needed to be trusted. Outside the window, the Harrow Wood was dark, its far part where nobody went, and Mira was not at its edge anymore. She was at the center of something, at the warm, breathing heart of a pack that had learned to let her in because she had sat with them through the long nights without asking for anything, and had stayed when it would have been easier to leave, and had known without being told where the real wound was, and had put her hands there and waited. She had come for the children. She had stayed for this, for the wolves who breathed more easily, for the keep that held its warmth differently than it had on the fourth night, for the man who had stopped being only the king and had become the man who sent food to a girl with a fraying strap and moved heavy things when she needed them moved and stood in doorways because his compass pointed toward her, and had stood in front of his whole court and said without any performance or qualification that he loved her. Not in spite of what she was, but because of it, because she had walked in through the east gate at midnight with nothing but her knowing and her willingness to stay. And how could he not love someone who had done that? Outside, the first winter snow was falling on the black stone of the keep, and inside, the Alpha King's mate was home.